The next morning, my daughter-in-law walked into the kitchen smiling like she had already won. Then she saw the folder waiting beside the coffee maker. She opened it, read the first line, and that smile disappeared. "What is this?" she whispered. I looked at her and said, "Exactly what you asked for." The floorboards in my hallway always creaked near the linen closet. I stopped in my tracks when I heard my daughter-in-law Megan talking to my son Mark. Her voice carried clearly through the cracked door. "If we make her feel awkward enough, she will pack her bags and move into a senior complex on her own," Megan said softly. "I will make her so uncomfortable, she will move out." Mark muttered something about waiting a few months, but Megan dismissed him. "We need this entire house for the baby's nursery and my home office. She is just holding us back." I stood in the dark corridor of my Portland Craftsman home, my hand resting against the cool wood trim. I was 64 years old, a retired botanical illustrator who had paid off this mortgage 3 years after my husband died. I did not cry or confront them. I walked back to my bedroom, sat at my desk, and opened my laptop. I possessed options they had never considered. If they wanted a quiet war over space, I would not engage in petty arguments. I spent 20 minutes looking through local rental listings, checking market values, and reading my property tax statements. I realized they viewed my generosity as weakness. When they moved in 8 months ago, after Mark lost his tech sales contract, I offered them the upper floor without charging rent. I cooked dinners, paid all utilities, and kept my studio strictly downstairs. Now, Megan believed she could push me out of the home I built over 35 years. I printed 3 documents from my office printer, signed each page in dark blue ink, and folded them neatly inside a manila folder. I did not sleep much, but my mind remained clear. By 5 in the morning, my plan was set, and the first step was already in motion. The kitchen smelled of fresh, dark roast when Megan walked downstairs at 7. She wore her silk bathrobe and carried her laptop, expecting her usual space on the kitchen island. I had already cleared my art supplies off the table, but I did not brew a full pot for everyone like I usually did. I poured my single cup and sat by the window. "Good morning, Evelyn Megan," said, her tone clipped as she opened the refrigerator. "Did you forget to buy almond milk again?" I told Mark. "We prefer it over whole milk." I took a slow sip of my coffee without looking up from my sketch pad. "I bought what I needed for my week," I replied calmly. She frowned, tapping her nails against the marble counter. "Well, we need to reorganize the pantry today. My mother is visiting next weekend, and we need space for her dietary supplements." I observed the subtle ways she took over territory. Over the past 4 months, her boxes had filled the garage. Her decorative pillows had replaced my hand-woven throws, and my framed botanical prints had been moved to the hallway. She acted like an owner, asserting dominance over a temporary boarder. Later that morning, Mark walked in, rubbing his eyes and looking nervously between us. He grabbed a mug, saw it was empty, and looked at me with slight confusion. "Mom, is the coffee pot broken?" he asked. "No, Mark," I said softly. "I only brewed enough for myself today." He blinked, unused to setting up his own morning routine in my house. Megan narrowed her eyes at me, sensing a subtle shift in the air, but she brushed it off as minor moodiness. She did not understand that small habits were merely the outer shell of much larger boundaries. I packed my leather tote bag and prepared to make a visit to my financial advisor. By Wednesday, the atmosphere in the house grew noticeably tenser. I stopped cooking dinner for 3. Instead of preparing large family meals every evening at 6, I cooked a small portion for myself at 4, cleaned my dishes immediately, and stored my groceries in a designated shelf. When Megan came downstairs, expecting a cooked meal, she found the stove cold and clean. "Evelyn, aren't we having dinner together?" she asked, hovering near the dining table. "I adjusted my eating schedule," I said, mildly, placing a book on my lap. "There is plenty of space in the fridge if you want to cook for yourselves." Mark looked uncomfortable, shuffling his feet near the hallway. "Mom, we usually share groceries. It saves money for everyone." I looked at my son, seeing the fatigue in his eyes, but also his refusal to stand up to his wife's demands. "We shared groceries when you moved in temporarily," Mark Warner reminded him. That was 8 months ago. Megan stepped forward, her arms crossed tight over her chest. "We are trying to save for a down payment, Evelyn. Buying separate food just increases household expenses. Plus, I need the main dining room table cleared permanently for my design projects." I stood up, smoothing my cardigan. "This table stays cleared for my reading," I said. "If you need workspace, your bedroom upstairs has a desk." Megan scoffed, turning to Mark with an exasperated sigh. "See what I mean? She's making simple things complicated." Mark looked away, caught between his wife's ambition and my quiet firmness. They still believed this was about minor household annoyances. They thought if they complained enough, I would yield and retreat into my bedroom. They did not realize I was systematically removing every service I provided, forcing them to experience the true cost of running this household without my silent labor supporting them. On Friday afternoon, I returned from my local gardening club to find my private studio door unlocked. I always kept it closed as it contained my professional watercolor pigments, archived botanical prints, and personal tax files. I walked in quietly and found Megan going through my metal filing cabinet. She held a stack of my real estate documents in her hands. "Can I help you find something, Megan?" I asked from the doorway, keeping my voice perfectly steady. She startled, dropping 2 pages onto the hardwood floor before quickly retrieving them. She did not even look embarrassed. "I was looking for the home manual," she said smoothly, adjusting her sweater. "The upstairs radiator is making noise. But I noticed these property tax records. You paid off this house completely 3 years ago." "That is correct," I said, walking over and taking the papers from her hands. "And my studio is a private space. Evelyn, we need to talk like adults," she said, stepping closer. "Mark and I are starting a family. This house has 4 bedrooms, but you only use 1 and this studio. It makes no financial sense for a single woman to occupy 6,000 square feet when we could use the space productively." I filed the papers back into the drawer and locked it with my key. "My space is used productively," I replied. "I live here." "You are being selfish," she muttered under her breath as she walked toward the door. "Mark's name should be on this deed anyway. He is your only child." Her statement confirmed everything I suspected. She did not just want me out of the way, she wanted legal leverage over my home. That evening, I called my attorney, Sarah Vance. We scheduled an early morning meeting at her downtown office to review the final details of my property transfer documents. The time for soft boundaries had officially ended. Sarah's office sat on the 12th floor overlooking the foggy Portland harbor. She reviewed the paperwork I placed across her mahogany desk, her eyes scanning the precise legal clauses. "Are you entirely sure about this?" Evelyn Sarah asked, setting down her gold pen. "Once this lease agreement and property trust transfer are filed, your son and daughter-in-law will have no legal standing to remain in the home without paying market rate." "I am completely sure," I said, looking out the window at the gray skyline. "I gave them shelter when they needed help. Instead of gratitude, Megan views my presence as an obstacle to remove." Sarah nodded slowly. "Under Oregon law, since they have resided there over 30 days without a formal lease, we must serve them a legal 30-day notice to vacate if you wish to lease the property to a third party or transfer it to the revocable trust. Include the 30-day notice," I said firmly. "I signed the master lease with the local botanical society this morning. They are renting the main floor and studio for their educational foundation starting next month." Sarah smiled faintly. "And where will you be living?" "I rented a 2-bedroom cottage near the waterfront," I answered, feeling a surge of lightness in my chest. "It has a sunroom facing the ocean and a small greenhouse. I paid the full year's rent in advance using my savings." Sarah stamped the legal documents, placed them in an official state envelope, and handed them to me. This is entirely legal, watertight, and enforceable. They will receive official notice tomorrow morning. I took the envelope and placed it in my purse. I felt no anger, only the quiet resolve of a woman who refused to be pushed out of her own life story. I drove back home, cooked a simple dinner, and prepared for the upcoming morning. That night, Megan and Mark held a loud conversation in the kitchen, purposely keeping the door open so I would hear them from the living room. Megan was speaking on speakerphone with her mother. "We are going to start repainting the living room walls light gray this weekend," Megan said loudly. "Evelyn's floral wallpaper is so outdated. It feels like living in a museum." Her mother's voice chirped back over the phone. "Has she agreed to move to the guest suite downstairs yet?" "She will." Megan laughed dismissively. "I left brochures for the senior living village on her kitchen counter yesterday." She gets the hint. "Once she moves down, we will take over the master suite." Mark's voice was quiet, hesitant. "Maybe we should talk to her first, Megan. She seemed distant lately." "Mark, stop being soft," Megan snapped. "Your mother is set in her ways. If we wait for her permission, we will be living in her shadow forever. We have to take charge of the house." I sat in my armchair, sipping tea, reading my book, and listening to every word. They genuinely believed I was helpless against their gradual takeover. They thought my quiet nature meant I lacked resolve. They did not realize that while they were planning to repaint my walls, I had already transferred the property title into my private living trust and finalized a commercial lease with an educational nonprofit. The entire house was no longer a residential family home. It was transitioning into a protected botanical foundation property. I closed my book, turned off the lamp, and went to bed early. I needed to be well rested for breakfast. The papers in my tote bag were ready, and the final conversation would happen on my terms in my dining room before the sun reached its peak. The morning sun filtered through the bay window, illuminating the polished oak table. I placed the official manila folder directly in the center of the table, right next to the coffee maker. Megan stepped into the kitchen first, dressed for her remote workday. She noticed the folder immediately and smiled smugly, assuming it was an application form for the senior apartment complex she had left brochures for. "Glad to see you are taking my suggestions seriously, Evelyn," she said, pouring herself a cup of water. Mark walked in right behind her, wearing his work shirt, looking tired. "What is that, Mom?" he asked, pulling out a chair. "Those are the official documents regarding the future of this house," I said, sitting opposite them. Megan sat down, pulling the folder toward her with an air of victory. "Well, it is about time. We can finally discuss how we will divide the space once you transition to smaller living." She pulled out the legal notice, her smile instantly freezing as her eyes caught the bold lettering at the top. "Notice to vacate and commercial lease notification." She read the first paragraph silently, her lips parting slightly. Mark leaned over her shoulder, his eyes widening as he scanned the legal seals and signatures. "What is this?" Megan whispered, her voice losing its previous confidence. "This is a notice that the property has been placed under the Evelyn Vance Botanical Trust," I explained calmly. "Furthermore, the main house and ground studio have been leased to the Oregon Botanical Society for their educational headquarters effective 30 days from today." Megan's face flushed bright red as she slammed her hand onto the table. "You leased the house. Where are we supposed to go?" "You have 30 days to find your own apartment," I said gently. "Just as you planned for me." Mark stared at the paper, his hands trembling slightly as he read the official eviction terms. "Mom, you can't do this to us," he stammered, looking up at me with desperate eyes. "We are your family. We don't have enough saved for a security deposit and first month's rent in this neighborhood. You had 8 months of rent-free living to save money." "Mark," I replied calmly. "Instead, you allowed your wife to plan my removal from my own home." Megan jumped out of her chair, her face contorted in anger. "This is petty revenge. You overheard us talking. You are kicking your own son out on the street because your feelings were hurt." I stood up, slowly maintaining my posture and keeping my voice soft, controlled, and absolute. "My feelings were not hurt, Megan. My eyes were opened. You stated clearly that you would make me so uncomfortable in my own home that I would move out. You treated my generosity as an inconvenience to be managed. We were just talking about our future." Megan yelled, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You are being vindictive." "No," I corrected her. "Vindictive would be locking you out today. I am giving you the legally required 30 days. I am also informing you that my new waterfront cottage only has space for me. I am no longer providing housing, cooking, or utility subsidies for capable adults." Mark hid his face in his hands, finally realizing the full weight of what had happened. He turned to Megan, his voice sharp for the first time in months. "I told you to stop pushing her, Megan. I told you." Megan looked between Mark and me, her former dominance entirely shattered. She realized she had played a high-stakes game of territory in a house she did not own against a woman who held every legal card. Over the next 3 weeks, the house felt vastly different. The arrogant atmosphere Megan had built evaporated, completely replaced by an urgent, quiet panic. Every evening, Mark and Megan sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by laptop screens, apartment applications, and credit check documents. The rental market in Portland was steep, and without my free housing, they were forced to look at small 2-bedroom apartments 30 minutes outside the city center. I did not gloat or bring up the past. I spent my days packing my personal art supplies, my heirloom porcelain, and my clothes into neat labeled boxes. Movers were scheduled for the last Friday of the month. On their final weekend, a moving truck arrived for Mark and Megan. They loaded their furniture silently under the gray autumn sky. Mark walked into my studio while I was wrapping a fragile glass vase in paper. He stood by the door looking genuinely remorseful. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said quietly. "I should have put a stop to her talk. I got comfortable letting her run things." I set the vase down and looked at my son. "I love you, Mark. But respect is not negotiable in my home. You need to build your life on your own merits, not by carving out space from mine." He nodded slowly, wiping his eyes. "We signed a lease on a small place in Gresham. It's tight, but we can afford it." "That is a good first step," I said softly. I handed him a small envelope containing $2,000. "This is for your security deposit. It is a gift, not an invitation to move back. Make it work." He took the envelope, hugged me tightly, and walked out to the moving truck without another word. By the end of the month, the house stood empty, clean and peaceful. Representatives from the Oregon Botanical Society arrived on Monday morning to receive the keys. They were thrilled with the studio space, promising to preserve the garden and use the rooms for community education. I shook their hands, handed over the master set of keys, and drove away in my station wagon. My new cottage by the water smelled of salt air and cedar wood. The sunroom was filled with natural light, perfect for my watercolor easels. Outside, a small greenhouse stood ready for spring planting. There were no arguments over kitchen counters, no hushed conversations in hallways, and no subtle power struggles over where I belonged. 2 months later, Mark called me on a Sunday afternoon. His voice sounded lighter, more mature. He and Megan were adjusting to their new apartment. They were paying their own bills, managing their own space, and learning how to live within their actual means. Megan had even sent a brief, polite text thanking me for the deposit assistance, acknowledging her past behavior without dramatic excuses. Our relationship had shifted from enmeshed conflict to clean, healthy distance. I invited Mark over for lunch the following weekend, making it clear that visits were welcomed, but my home remained entirely my own. Hanging my finished botanical paintings in my new living room, I felt a deep sense of contentment. I had not lost my home. I had simply exchanged a battleground for a sanctuary. I sat by the glass windows, pulled out a fresh sheet of cold-pressed paper, dipped my brush into green pigment, and began to paint the ocean view before me completely free.